guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my Flagstaff home. I'm here today for another pine needle basket video, and today I'm talking about the best place to harvest your pine needles. So in order to make a pine needle basket, you have to have pine needles that are at least 5 inches long. And some of you, especially if you live in the eastern United States, you're gasping and you're saying, why would you ever use a pine needle that it's only 5 inches long? In the West, pine needles are not as long. So the ponderosa pine tree has the longest needles. They're usually between 7 and 9 inches long. I'll give you a scenario though later about where you could get longer ones than that. But usually they're in that range, but you're going to find a lot of them that are quite a bit shorter. I have talked to someone who made a pine needle basket with 3-inch needles. I don't know how in the world she did that. That must have been so frustrating. And the end result is going to be not quite as neat as longer ones because you get all these shaggy ends around the basket that doesn't look as nice. So you really need 5 inches, but I don't even pick up a pine needle that's 5 inches anymore because I know I can find plenty that are in the 7 to 9 inch range. Now, a lot of people say to me, oh, I have 18 bags of pine needles out on the curb waiting for trash pickup. You can come get those. The problem with that is that when you live in a place that is dry, the pine needles are also dry, and those people are shoving the pine needles into bags and they break really easily. Now, like I said, if you live on the East Coast, your pine needles that you find on the ground are probably quite flexible. In fact, these are, now on the East Coast, let me just say, if you're watching this video and you have access to the pine needles from loblollies or the South Florida pine, you just don't even need to be watching this video because, yeah, you don't. You don't need to, because the pine needles are really long and they're also really flexible when you first find them. So they're rarely broken. So I want to show you an example of, here is a long ponderosa pine needle. Okay, got that? And then this is from the South Florida pine. So we go from this length to that length. You know, it's a good 4 inches longer than this one. And this one's really long for a ponderosa. So how do you get long pine needles? If what you have access to are typically like 7 or 9 inches, where do you find them? Well, I got the brilliant idea, I thought it was at the time, of going up to on the mountain where I live. Now I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. We have this huge mountain. It goes up to like 16,000 feet in elevation, maybe higher. And I thought that would be a great place to harvest really long pine needles. So I dragged my husband with me and my video camera and all this, and went up there and realized that the pine needles were shorter. Why were they shorter? Well, it could have been elevation, but what I later learned is it's really all about water. So in my experience, pine needles grow longer when they have access to water. And so on a mountain where there's a slope, if it gets rain, the water runs off. So maybe if there was a ravine or something up on the mountain, the pine needles that were, or the pine trees that were in that area would grow longer needles. But I found that I really didn't have to go any farther than my own backyard. And I found 3 locations in my yard where the needles are longest. The first was near my vegetable garden where I have sprinklers, my flower garden too. I had sprinklers set up. The pine trees were getting watered for many months of the year because the garden was getting watered. The second place was over on the side of my house, and I think that was probably affected by my neighbor's garden on the other side of the fence. And then the other place was one side of my front yard where my neighbor's yard and my yard came together, and it kind of sloped together. And so when it rained, it kind of went into this trough and all the needles were longer in those 3 spots. I usually gather my pine needles in the fall because we have a rainy season at the middle to end of summer where I live. And so it seems like the needles are ready to go at that time. Plus they're all coming down from the trees in the fall. And so that is a good time to do that. But a couple of years ago, we actually got 12 feet of snow in one winter here in northern Arizona. And that year, I was able to gather really long pine needles, like 10 inches long. And I know if you're still watching and you're from the East Coast or the East, you're probably laughing like our pine needles are 14 inches long. I know. So, but they had really long needles, 10 inches long, and I got a whole bunch of them in the fall. And then I got another whole slew again in the spring. So if you happen to have a year where you get a lot of precipitation in the form of rain or snow, be on the lookout because you're probably going to have longer pine needles that year. Also, be sure when you gather them that you're being really gentle with them. You don't want to shove them into a bag. You want to very gently place them in a bag and don't make the bag too tightly filled because these brittle pine needles will break. I have another video right here for you and also in the description box that is my step-by-step tutorial. It's a 45-minute long video that shows you in depth how to make a basket from start to finish. So I would encourage you to check that out if you haven't already or if you don't know how to make a basket. I also have several other videos about treating your pine needles with glycerin and also whether or not you can use green pine needles. But the next time you are looking for long pine needles, skip the slopes and head to the valleys because that's where you're going to find your longest pine needles. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions. I would love to hear about your experiences with harvesting needles and making your own pine needle projects. Once again, thank you so much for joining me on my Flagstaff home. And if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. Take care, you guys. Bye.